And I think we're about ready to start things. So as usual through this week, I'm going to hand it over to TI Canada's Chair and President, Susan Cote-Freeman, to kick things off. So Susan, over to you.
Thank you, James. Hello, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue. So it's day 5. James, am I still on? Somehow I seem to have lost...
No, you're still on.
I'm still on. Sorry about that. I'll keep going. I seem to have lost my camera. Let's see if I can do that again. Here we are. Apologies for that. So we're day 5, and I really do want to thank all of you who've been with us this week, whether you've dipped in and out, or whether you've been with us every day this week. We really appreciate your participation. I also take the opportunity on behalf of the TI board and on my behalf, obviously, to thank all our panelists and participants throughout the week. I think we had some really quality discussions, and I really look forward to today, where we're going to try to pull it all together and extract some lessons from what we heard this week. And I also wanted to say that these discussions are not just shop talk for us. I mean, they do actually serve as findings for us and substance for our advocacy. So the contact we have with experts is really essential, and we're really happy that we could share this with all of you this week. So this is a moment where I thank our donors, because without their support, none of our work is possible. So I want to thank our platinum supporter, Export Development Canada, our gold supporters, BLG, Blake's, Banque Nationale, Deloitte Canada, Dentons Canada, Sky Power Global, and Siemens. And finally, our silver supporters, ACFO, Alessa, Kinross Gold, KPMG Canada, Thales Canada, and Vidoc Group. I also want to encourage you to become supporters or members of TI Canada. We want to expand our reach, and we need more members. So please don't hesitate to join, and you can do so by going to transparencycanada.ca. Just a quick reminder, we're again today in webinar mode. You can write in comments. We encourage you to communicate with each other through the comment function. Address your questions through the Q&A function, and our moderator will be monitoring this. Our moderator for today's session is Rita Trichur. Rita is a business columnist with the Globe and Mail, and previously she was financial services editor. Rita returned to the Globe in 2016 after working as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in its Canada office, Canada Bureau. And prior to the Wall Street Journal, Rita spent more than 3 years at the Globe. She also worked at the Toronto Star, the Canadian Press, and the Ottawa Sun. She has a Bachelor of Journalism and Political Science and an MA in Canadian Studies. So welcome, Rita, and thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. So as you heard, everyone, my name is Rita Trichur. I'm a business columnist here at the Globe and Mail. I've written a lot about many of these issues involving white-collar crime, money laundering, corruption, both in my roles here at the Globe and Mail and in my previous roles at the Wall Street Journal. These are topics that I'm very, very passionate about, and I'm really excited about today's discussion. I'm so pleased to be your moderator for this wrap-up panel. Our panelists are fantastic, and you're going to walk away with some great insights. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce them. Dr. Daniela Chimisso de Santos, Senior Advisor at Proactiva, Anthony Cole, Partner at Dentons, Richard Bistrong, Owner, Frontline Anti-Bribery LLC, and of course, James Cohen, who you all know is Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. So folks, I want to jump right in. It's been a very interesting week, and lots of interesting speakers, lots of interesting highlights. Want to hear from each of you about what is wrong with us. So after everything you've heard, what stands out most in your mind? Richard, maybe we can start with you.
Well, it's a challenging question, and thank you, Rita, and thank you to Susan and to James and Transparency International for the opportunity to moderate a session on examples from overseas. And I think one of the bigger takeaways from the examples from overseas is that it might not be as much as we think if the corporate community takes the leadership on ethics and compliance and anti-bribery initiatives, even if the sort of functional institutions and the state institutions aren't, as Drago Kos said on the first day, Canada has a great car of anti-bribery. You just need to go ahead and drive it. But even if the state is a laggard in terms of lifting up those institutions and those functions that are there to enforce it, that doesn't get in the way of organizations from committing to ethics and compliance and anti-bribery. And Ulrich, who's the chairman of Transparency International Sweden, I think gave a very cautionary tale, because that is essentially what happened in Sweden, as there were some major scandals there. I think a few top 10 in our anti-bribery enforcement world. And that really shook the compliance community in Sweden, even though the investigatorial and prosecutorial resources aren't as strong and robust as we would like them to be. We have a community there that's now very engaged and taking it seriously. And, Kerry Power, the CEO of Sky Power, talked about there's nothing that prevents organizations from being on their front foot with ethical and sustainable business practices. And he gave some great examples, including walking away from business. And I think that is such a great measure of an organization's commitment to ethical business practices, is to say no. So he was a real shining light, I think, not only for Canada, but for the rest of the world and multinationals that are looking to grow in some volatile and high-risk regions. And Mairead Lavery over at EDC, she also talked about how a development bank can help sort of lift the water level on the entire country, so to speak, and to help organizations with the tools and the resources that they need to think about sort of what are the risks up front, what are the resources we need to address what could be these risks before we put boots on the ground. So I found it to be a very, uplifting conversation, in that what's wrong with Canada, there might be some focus on those state institutions, but from the corporate perspective, I think there was a very uplifting conversation.
That's a great point that you made about just saying no to business that might be problematic. And I think increasingly you'll find that, given other developments in corporate governance, businesses feel other pressures from investors, for example, to say no, because it creates reputational risk, and you end up leaving money on the table. Daniela, what about you? Just as opening thoughts, as you reflect back on this week, what's wrong with Canada?
So I think this week it's just been a fantastic week. We've just had such great discussion, and specifically in the panel that I moderated, we looked at institutions, and I came out with some real I think a deeper understanding of what's really going on. We talk about Canada, and we talk about the constellation of institutions that govern anti-corruption and illicit flows of money, and however you want to define that broad spectrum of issues. And we've come to the conclusion that it's lacking because of the output, in the sense of, in the sense of a low enforcement rates and low conviction rates. And then when you look at the upstream of the process, and you look at, we had a lot of discussion on a number of pillars, I would say, institutional pillars. For example, legislative reform. Where do we need to change? Well, we need legislative reform. Where do we need change? We need to create a new national agency for beneficial ownership registry. We need change. And this was, I thought, was one of the most interesting discussions that we had, was with regards to a federal investigating anti-corruption unit. And this was a really good discussion that was between Peter and Paul, and Carolyn, who is in the SFO office, came in with some very exciting views of new institutions that are being created and that are having some success. But I think I think that one of the most important outputs of this discussion is that when we look at, again, this constellation of institutions, some that work, some that don't work, what's going on, how do we fix this? I don't think it's sufficient to just throw money, resources, and technology at it. You actually have to look at the human capital aspect of all of this. And I think, to me, that was one of the biggest learnings, is that, you know, we consider the human capital, of course we do, but I think that from my panel, what I really heard loud and clear from both Paul and Peter is that we need to look at education, training of the resource members of staff, but also career progression aspects. We need to look at, you know, the self-actualization of professionals that are in this spectrum, and how they can actually retain the work and not create barriers or create structures that don't allow them to thrive, in a way that all these institutional and legislative frameworks that are in place are not actually being put at play correctly. So for me, that was one of the biggest outputs that I would say from this week.
And what about you, Anthony? You know, in terms of your kind of main takeaway about what's wrong with Canada, I mean, what would you say the highlight would be?
So, I mean, I've had the opportunity of joining or listening into the other panel sessions as well. And to me, there's been a pretty consistent message coming out of those panels, and it is, as Daniela was just saying, I think perhaps the biggest thing we've heard spoken about is the lack of enforcement, or a relatively modest level of enforcement. I mean, my panel looked at, you know, what's missing potentially from the anti-bribery, anti-money laundering toolbox, which primarily was intended to focus on legislative issues, legislative gaps. But I think the consensus among the panelists was that the legislative framework actually isn't that bad. It can be improved, sure. There might be tweaks that could be made, sure, but I think that's true of most jurisdictions, even in the US, even in the UK. I think where the sense is that Canada is potentially falling short is in the most effective utilization of what's there. And while we can look, and I'm not saying we shouldn't look at legislative change, I think perhaps the most urgent issue is how do we maximize the use of the existing framework, and that includes some relatively recent changes, including my panel talked about remediation agreements, deferred prosecution agreements, which have been used incredibly successfully. Jessica on my panel spoke quite extensively about how effectively the use of deferred prosecutions agreements had gone in the US, and how critical that had been to really changing, not only in just generating more cases, more enforcement, but also in coming back to what Richard was saying, encouraging corporations to actually take anti-corruption compliance seriously. My experience is anti-corruption, anti-bribery compliance, anti-money laundering compliance is not straightforward. It's not just a zero tolerance statement and a policy. It's a living, breathing, continual exercise, and it does exhaust or take a lot of time, management time, employee time, money being invested in those programs. And unless two things: one is you need to have some level of enforcement for that to be justified, that level of investment to be kind of justified. But also, and this comes back to something Daniela was saying, is the messaging from the agencies involved, the stakeholders involved, to the public. And when I say the public, I mean general public, but also the corporate world as well. Is this one needs to be taken seriously, because we're going to get very serious about it. But also listening to concerns from the corporate world about, suggestions as to how it can be done more effectively, more effective partnerships. So there's a dialogue going on between the enforcement side, the lawmakers, and the public and the corporate world about what compliance means. Just to finish that off, or to tie that up, again on my panel, Amy Sandu mentioned that there was a lack of guidance. If you look to the US, you look to the UK, there's some fairly extensive guidance that's come out from those responsible for enforcement about what their expectations are. That is not the case in Canada. It's just completely absent. So that message needs to come out from somewhere. I also think that ties into what Daniela was saying about an agency with responsibility for this. Because if you have a single agency that is responsible and that has a strategic mandate to really drive this in a very concentrated fashion forward, then they have an interest, and they are the right body to be giving that message, giving that coherent, clear message. This is what we expect, and I think that would help hugely in terms of encouraging corporate compliance as well.
Excellent. James, I want to give you kind of the last word on this kind of opening question about what's wrong with Canada.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, this has been an exceptional week, and just thank you to Anthony, Daniela, and Richard for great moderation, and also Diana Swain from CBC for great moderation on the first day, and all the panelists for exceptional insights, and of course, everyone who's joined us through the week and has asked great questions. Remember, questions for the panel in the Q&A box, general commentary and chat amongst yourselves, and I see there's plenty going on in the chat box. Susan framed everything at the beginning of this week about where this question, what's wrong with Canada, comes from. TI Canada this year, we're developing our new strategic plan. We're wrapping up our current one, 2018 to 2020. And as we talk to TI Canada members, supporters, and other influential Canadians, the enforcement issue around anti-corruption really came up a lot. And since I've been with TI Canada for the last 4 years, we've all been scratching our heads of why isn't there more enforcement? And so it led to this question of, well, why don't we just frame the whole week of dialogue around this question? And it doesn't even necessarily have to be true. I've heard from some people who definitely don't agree with what one of our panelists said, our former chair said, was a clickbaity title of What's Wrong with Canada? Are we taking anti-corruption seriously? But I think there's been enough happening or lack of happening to warrant the question. And out of the week, I've heard no silver bullet, naturally, and I don't think there is. There's a couple of things to talk about, I think. One is there's definitely structural issues, and I think Daniela and Anthony talked about that. And I've always heard it on the sidelines from people, and there are various reports out there about institutional problems of staffing, of the structure of some of our anti-corruption units, their linkages to each other. There's a lot of great people working in the RCMP, in OSFI, in FinTrack, and a lot of the former staff have worked with us, or we have good relationships with them. And we want to see them do their job well and enforce corruption. But I think at this point, there's time worthwhile to review these structural issues that hold us back so that we can see if there's tweaking that needs to be done to create the best institutions and do some peer review. I think Paul Garside from VDOC Group on day 2 pointed out, well, let's look at some of our peers from the Exporting Corruption report who did better than us and have centralized integrated units. So there's that. On tools, I think Anthony's right. From his session, we've had some new tools come in. When TI Canada came out in favor of deferred prosecution agreements, we called the report another arrow in the quiver. Thank you to our former chair, Paul Lalonde, for the title. And so we constantly think, well, what are other arrows to put in there? Are there other tools? And maybe it is that we've kind of tweaked the tools enough that we just need to get on enforcement. But I would say the one tool that is critically missing is a centralized, publicly available registry of beneficial ownership. I mean, TI Canada, this is one of our key advocacy points with some of our partners. We've heard this from business. We've heard this from law enforcement that they even need this. I mean, I should have expected it that the RCMP has to pay for access to provincial corporate registries. I mean, it's a straightforward thing when you think about it, but I hadn't thought about it before until someone from the RCMP told me that. I mean, that shouldn't be the case. Law enforcement should be able to not have these barriers to make sure we root out people who want to abuse our system. So I think on tools and institutions, we have some things there. And then there becomes education. And that came out a lot this week. I do read the comments sections in the Globe and Mail and the CBC, and whenever we post something, and I'll see your articles, Rita, on Twitter, and then you'll see the comments of a lot of, duh, was it a slow news day? Of course there's corruption in Canada. So there's this view of Canadians don't know there's corruption, but there's actually a lot of Canadians who do know there's corruption. And we could have titled maybe this week, what's wrong with our white collar crime enforcement, because we're not talking about, or we've talked very little about, say, lobbying laws, or we've hinted at municipal issues and said tying anti-corruption to these more tangible issues for the average Canadian is very important. And I would agree. I think a lot of Canadians are very aware of that, especially when you put money laundering to housing, like the Cullen Commission that's going on in parallel to our session right now. We saw the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec really bring it to life. But I think there's still more education to be done. Last year, when the SNC-Lavalin trial and deferred prosecution agreements really came to the headlines, and even Prime Minister Trudeau acknowledged money laundering as a national level issue last year, we really saw it come up. But there was still, I was really disheartened to see comments and publications by some prominent Canadians saying, well, what's the big deal? That's just the way it's done in some of these countries. One journalist even bragging about paying bribes when he was in his job to get it done. And we need to get past that. And I think something that came across maybe yesterday is that social media is bringing that message back. And more leaks and files like the Panama Papers and these global coordinated journalist efforts are bringing these stories. So if we just look at the FinCEN file leak at the beginning of this month, CBC brought out the connection between shell companies in New Brunswick and fishing trolleys off the coast of West Africa. I mean, this is a bit of an extended loop that I'm about to go through here, but illegal fishing and shell companies to fund that illegal fishing, to deprive some people of the poorest countries in the world of their livelihoods, to wreak ecological havoc on some of these areas, to destabilize their economy further, that maybe they'll join transnational gangs or even terrorist gangs, not because they're ideologically affiliated, but because there's no other job market, because we allowed for the financing of fishing trolleys to end their lives. And then the elites in those countries who take a profit from the irregular border crossings or other smuggling, they might put that money right back into maybe coming from West Africa, maybe into Montreal. I mean, there's a lot of focus in Toronto and Vancouver on illicit financial flows in real estate. Montreal is definitely there. And then that pushes people, and I'm going to say here, my generation, sorry, everybody, out of the housing market. I'm looking for a house in Toronto right now, and it makes me cry each time. And then also that money for some of these houses might be fronted by legal money from gangs who also use shell companies. So it's a long cycle all the way back. But that impact, that global impact and that local impact, I think is starting to come through, and we can do even more, so that at our political level, the need for a mandate to tackle these issues and not just wave the Canadian flag and say, we can put a Canadian flag on anything and we're good corporate citizens, we're good citizens around the world. I think we need to get over that. And I think we need to do a lot to earn that reputation that we so often think we just have a right to.
So let me ask you this. Obviously we've seen that financial crime, as you pointed out, is linked to, pushing certain people out of the housing market, kind of heating up of the housing market. It's been linked to the opioid crisis. We now have the UN warning that, the illicit financial flows could actually derail the global recovery from this pandemic that we're currently in. Do you think that this moment is going to be the catalyst for change? Or what do you think it's going to take to create substantive change in Canada? Anthony, I want to start with you.
It could be, but I'm not sure it's going to be I think it's going to take leadership, probably at a federal government level, to drag this forward. Someone that needs to be effectively a high-profile sponsor of a real heartfelt evaluation of why enforcement is not what it should be in Canada. And I think, as I say, it's got to come from the top. I really don't want it to be a hideous scandal that is the driver. You want to see change before you have that kind of harmful event occurring. We've had several. There's lots of things you can point to now. There's lots of really compelling policy justification for taking this very seriously. You've mentioned a couple there. They are real things. With corruption, foreign corruption, which is, you know, what I deal with a lot, the impacts of that are very real. James was talking about those. They're not just, it's the cost of doing business. It has a very serious knock-on effect. And I think, you know, that there is the capacity for that to resonate with the Canadian public. I think the media have a role to play in that. I think, you know, it's good to see stories being picked up, being dealt with in the media. So I think, you know, an active and robust approach by the media is going to be important. But ultimately, if we're talking about, you know, enforcement being the problem, then I think it's going to take, senior federal level leadership to really make a change.
Daniela, what about you? What are your thoughts about what the catalyst for change ought to be? Is now the moment with the pandemic, or no?
So I think that's a great question, because first of all, I think we need to take a look at what we're looking at right now, what we're experiencing in the COVID world, right? And this is one thing that was actually discussed in our panel. And Peter Dent actually talked about the amount of procurement that occurred without any sort of supervision and with incredible opportunity for corrupt and illicit activities. Yeah. Just to say that this is not something that's just in Canada, all over the world, we've seen this, that the COVID world has actually brought about a number of a peak of illicit activity with regards to public procurement, with all sorts of things related to COVID. Now, why would a post-COVID world then fix something that we're seeing has actually heightened, right? I think that it is possible. I think it is possible because we are going through a moment in which there is a revision of values, right? We're looking at a green economy. We're looking at how we're going to make the world a better place, or at least question where we are from a status quo perspective. And if that's the case, then one of the things that ought to be in the agenda is the sort of the anti-corruption governance agenda, right? Which includes, you know, anti-corruption, includes a bunch of other things. But I agree with Anthony on one critical aspect. There needs to be political will, and there needs to be a sponsor. You need to have somebody that is actually going to raise this flag and make it their own and push change. And it, you know, how do we get this person? How do we get there? As Anthony said, we can go maybe a scandal, maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe there are different ways of doing this, but there needs to be ownership of the issue, and not sort of pushing this around of, you know, this is not really my issue, this is somebody else's issue, and this is, right, we need to put more money in it, we need to put resources in it, we need to create a new institution. Well, we need to own it first and foremost.
Richard, you have a different perspective coming from the United States. Obviously, you guys are headed to the polls in a matter of days. Could the political will to tackle this issue be inspired by, in Canada, be inspired by US leadership or leadership change?
That's a complex question. So before I address that, just with respect to the last round of comments, I couldn't agree with Anthony more that, you know, just say no is not a policy. Talking as my former commercial self and from the panel yesterday, just say no is a wall poster, right? I mean, this is a highly complex issue, and there's one thing that's for sure is aspirational goals need to be operationalized. And we spoke a lot about that yesterday in terms of really understanding the risks that you're going to face before you're in the middle of them. And do you understand the resources that you're going to need, whether it's due diligence or extra compliance personnel or technology, to address new markets before you've committed those resources? So that's a great point. And a few people talked about education. You know, for people in the commercial workforce that might think that a small bribe to a customs official or an inspection official just might be something to move a process along. I mean, education goes a long way with that, and Drago talked about it on Monday. Kerry and Murray talked about it yesterday, like making sure that people understand what you call a small bribe, we call transnational crime. So if you want to think of yourself as a participant in that ecosystem, well, let's call it for what it is. And really raising both public and corporate awareness as to what the big picture is here in terms of illicit cash flows. It's more than just giving pocket change or what we might think of as pocket change to a customs official who might have had to buy that role, right? He or she bought that position and that money went somewhere else. So education goes a long way. So great points there. As to the catalyst for change, that's a really tough one, particularly in this COVID environment. And Daniela really said it well. We have bubble procurement right now and a tremendous amount of public monies flowing through without the sort of controls that we'd like to see. So I don't think this COVID environment is slowing down corruption risk. It might even be increasing it. I've never heard of corruption risk about being declared an essential business, which can be life and death for a company in some parts of the world. So we're seeing risks now that we didn't see, 9 months ago and a year ago. And I think the other problem with a crisis environment being a catalyst for change, Rita, is it might be the opposite, particularly where multinationals are now looking to hit the start button to resume operations. And there's sort of this commercial need for speed where, ethics and compliance leaders that might want to slow down organizations hit the pause button and to think about, listen, we need to make sure we don't have a regulatory issue after that we don't have a regulatory crisis after the health and economic crisis has passed. That might not be very popular right now. So I'm not sure that a crisis environment and a corporate crisis mentality is going to slow things down. So I think the catalyst for change that we're talking about, everything that we've been discussing, the political will, and where the political will might be absent. So notice I'm not making any judgment about what's going to happen next week. Then maybe the corporate will is what needs to really be the catalyst for change. And I think that was just a wonderful idea to bring in Ulrich from Sweden to talk about how in Sweden it was really the ethics and compliance community, but speaking to what Anthony shared, with some major global crises and scandals that happened, that was the catalyst to action. Hopefully Canadian companies and their employees can start to think about, we don't necessarily have to have a top 10 anti-bribery enforcement action to be a catalyst for change. And going back to what Drago talked about and to what most of the panel yesterday addressed, increasing public and corporate awareness about this is not a victimless crime. There are significant economic, societal impacts, both in the country where these companies are based and in the societies where they're engaging. So, Rita, I think it's going to be more organically as opposed to like an individual lightning bolt that really sort of moves the needle on this.
Okay, well,
Rita, can I just add one thing to what Richard's mentioned? Because the only thing that I think that to me is perhaps not as clear. I don't think that there is no corporate acknowledgement or awareness or lack of education. I think the corporate world understands quite clearly what are the risks, what is corruption, how it works, what are the impacts, right? I think that there's no issue of education in the corporate sector.
Agreed.
Then the question is, why they do it and how it moves forward, and if they could be the leaders. And I think that's a very complex question, but I just wanted to make sure that, at least in my mind, when we look at corporations, especially very sophisticated corporations that have been caught in enormous scandals, right? And that have had spectacular certificates, and they're on their, you know, footsies and all these Dow Jones sustainability, and then you see what's happened. So it's not a lack of awareness or lack of knowledge or lack of education, it's lack of doing. And the question then is it the carrot and stick model the only model that works with corporations or not? And then, you know, that's a much deeper question. I just wanted to, sorry.
No, not at all.
Sorry, I just wanted to.
That's a great point. I actually want to get to the issue of the role of the corporation in a bit, but before we do that, I want to pivot a bit. James, I want to come to you on this because I want to talk a little bit about the lack of enforcement that seems to be kind of the central theme that has been identified. You know, average Canadians are often shocked to learn that the RCMP shuttered its national proceeds of crime and commercial crime sections in 2012, and then took a 5-year holiday from investigating white-collar crime altogether. You know, when I learned that, just not just as a journalist, but as a Canadian, it blew my mind. I mean, it just, like, how is that possible that we don't have federal police looking at white-collar crime in Canada for 5 years? And how are our legislators okay with that? I'm wondering, though, if there is a mindset or leadership problem at the RCMP that needs to be tackled. And I'm wondering if you can kick us off on that one.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there are people who are dedicated to this cause at the RCMP at the operational level who are working on this. And so it always comes down to, you know, restructuring plans. And one thing we heard from Paul Gariside, who was IMAT, is this idea of, you know, amalgamating budgets for efficiencies. And so therefore, you know, we'll just pool everyone together and everybody can pull from each other. And that creates efficiency because that's the buzzword for everybody, you know, let's run government like a business. And then we heard from Paul, the larger mandate winds up swallowing the smaller one. And I think Diane Francis in National Post yesterday put up an article, thank you to Jean-Pierre for pointing that one to me, about OSFI and the combination of budgets there. And I was talking to another journalist about this. And it's the point of, yeah, you can draw from different people, but also you lack the expertise. So I think there's kind of two things at play there. There's one, the let's be efficient with government resources, which, yes, of course, Canadians want their taxpayers' dollars to be used efficiently. But then there's also smart about what's your objective. And if there's not the political mandate towards white-collar crime, then, yeah, the mandates are going to be downplayed. The budgets are going to be cut, and the needs for expertise aren't going to be placed there. So whether it's, you know, the top leadership of the RCMP or the top leadership of Bill Blair's office and Public Protection Canada, I don't know where maybe the disconnect is, or even Finance Canada. I know there's a whole unit, Finance Canada, that's exceptionally concerned with this. So in terms of political will, I mean, going back to like, what's the motivator, and I see everyone chatting about it, you know, unfortunately it seems to be scandal. You'd like to say that everyone's going to wake up one day and just hear things, but it's not. And the unfortunate thing is as well about our very expansive nature of the country is that we tend to regionalize. So we all remember Richard for the American. On Maclean's magazine, there was a cover, maybe 2010 it was, if anybody wants to correct me, of what's wrong with Quebec. And it was Charbonneau Commission, Quebec, everybody knows Quebec is a special issue, corruption everywhere. But now it's BC, and the Cullen Commission, and the Vancouver model of money laundering. Well, that's over on the other side of the mountains. It seems to be, unfortunately, until Ontario gets smacked right in the face, that things aren't changing enough, or until we have just a massive multinational fall into place. I talked with one bureaucrat maybe 2 years ago trying to talk about beneficial ownership transparency. I wasn't really getting far in the technicalities, and a colleague said, you know, put this public registry in place before there's a scandal that's on your front page. And then he just kind of perked up. It was like, now you've got my attention. Really? That's what it took to get your attention? So there are people, not to bash all bureaucrats by any means, there's lots of people in the federal, provincial governments who are working on this, but the mandate on compared to competing mandates doesn't seem to be getting through about what are the technical issues that need to be done to make this work.
It's that's an interesting point. Just staying with you for a minute, James. One senior RCMP officer I've interviewed during the course of my work has suggested that there needs to be a change in the way law enforcement is compensated. And so he said specifically with the RCMP, salary increases are tied to rank rather than specialization. I'm just curious on your thoughts, and he thinks that that should change to ensure there's enough expertise. You know, is it also a question of how resources that are currently, like the existing budgets, could be reallocated or reimagining?
For myself, I mean, I couldn't answer that question specifically. I think for me, I would need to be doing a deep dive. I've certainly heard from enough RCMP officers on sidelines or ex-RCMP officers about the structures. I mean, shameless plug, this would be a wonderful research project for TI Canada that we would love to look at. Canada's structural issues and build on this week and really do a deep dive and present solutions, not just to beat up on the RCMP and other organizations, but to an organization like ours with our mandate, our advocacy mandate to really push it forward. But as terms of the specific pay raise scale, I'd have to leave that to somebody with more experience directly in that than me. Maybe Anthony is about to crack into that.
Excellent.
Just actually on your last two questions, which I think are interrelated, I don't actually think it's right that there was a hiatus on white collar crime or economic crime enforcement within the RCMP. In point of fact, that there isn't. That the difficulty we have though is there are often shifting initiatives, structures, programs, policies around economic crime enforcement. So we've had we've had initiatives come and go, structures come and go within the RCMP, and it can create that perception that enforcement isn't happening. Well, there hasn't been a lot of enforcement, particularly in the anti-corruption space or certainly the anti-money laundering space. But one thing I would say is there's some very capable, dedicated, committed people within the LCMP who are and have been investigating these kinds of offences for many years. Do they have all the resources they need? Not so convinced. Is the institutional structure the right one? And that is a big question. I think that comes to the next point, which you talked about pay scales. One of the issues that I think is a live one, and it needs to be, I think, evaluated properly, is the RCMP. It's a federal policing force that has an awful lot of responsibility. It's also doing a large portion of its work is community policing. It's also responsible for very complex international economic crimes. Those are massively different types of investigation that require massively different skill sets. Even drugs, you often have prosecutors who may do, specialize in or do a lot of drug prosecutions. They're also doing, potentially they'll be the ones doing money laundering as well. Those are very different skill sets as well. So it's that, both on the investigative side and the prosecutorial side, there's a real stretching of resources and expertise in those institutions. So I think there needs to be an evaluation of, is that where the right place for it to be, or is it within the RCMP? Is it within the PPSC, or is there a national crime agency and along the model of the Serious Fraud Office in the UK, the US DOJ, where you have integrated teams? One of the panels talked about the Ontario Serious Fraud Office and its role in this. I think it can have a big impact in Ontario, but it's a provincial agency at the end of the day. This has to be federal. It really does have to be federal. There are other things within the RCMP that the time it takes to get specialized in one of these types of investigations is several years, 2-3 years. That is the same kind of time frame you're looking at to get to the next level for a promotion. And to get that promotion, you have to go out. So you end up with this building of capacity, building of expertise, and then there's pressure from a career point. Anyone would do the same thing. It's, if you want to progress in this organization, you got to go somewhere else within the RCMP. So all of that expertise, that know-how, is at risk of being lost. And I think those are the kinds of issues that need to be addressed, seriously evaluated. And as I say, there are models elsewhere of specialized integrated crime agencies where you have, even in Canada, we've got reports. There was a report done 15 years ago by former Supreme Court Justice Corrie that looked at securities enforcement. And if you read that report, a lot of the things that he's saying in that report, there was another author who I'm doing a disservice to by not mentioning, but if you look at that report, a lot of the things that are said in that report are still just as true today in terms of anti-corruption, anti-money laundering enforcement. So those haven't been implemented or properly addressed. And again, to me, that needs leadership at a federal government level. Someone, probably one person at a senior level to really say, I'm going to own this. You look at the BC Money Laundering Commission, the Cohen Commission, that's David Eby who's driven that. So, shout out to him for really driving anti-money, but that should be a federal commission of inquiry. BC are right to do it, but there really ought to be one federally. And that took, a senior government official making it a project.
Okay, one of the points you raise, it's not just about the RCMP, although they have a role to play. As all of you have mentioned, there are other regulators, other institutions that are involved in this, OSFI being one, FinTrack, also another example. I'm wondering if there's a lack of cooperation among regulators and if that's also a hindrance. Just to kind of put a finer point on this, Maureen Jensen, who used to be the chair of the Ontario Securities Commission, once talked about the difficulty of regulators working together. And she said, it's kind of like porcupines mating. You have to be very careful and everyone's a little worried where the boundaries are. And so I'm wondering if there's an issue of turf wars and how we might overcome that in Canada within these institutions. Daniela, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do. I think that, well, first of all, and I should preface this that I'm not going to go all academic on this, but ultimately, if you look at the actual nature of institutions, the reality is that there is a tendency to isolate oneself and to create sort of a fiefdom or a kingdom within that institutional framework. And the question is then, how does that institution co-evolve, or how does it relate with other organizations or other institutions? And this is obviously not a problem. It's a problem that we don't see only in this space, but we see in a number of different spaces. And a very typical space where we see this is any sort of corporate accountability. So we look at corporate accountability; it's the same kind of issue, right? Which institution is actually responsible, and those that are responsible for bits and pieces of it, there's not a lot of relationship with other institutions. I think that the way the solution here is a federal initiative. I think that's really the only way that you're going to be able to cross these borders. It is imperative that the federal government takes this as its own and then runs with it. I think that the provincial interests are different. We have the enormity of Canada expresses it. The same for the problems that you see in Newfoundland. I've worked a lot in Newfoundland and Labrador, are not the same where I am right now in BC. And the kind of issues that come up and the kind of institutional frameworks that are working in one and the other, maybe they have the same name, but are not necessarily have the same scope or mandate, or the way that they work, their practices are different. So I think that this really is a role for the federal government to take a stance.
I want to pivot a bit and go to Richard to talk about the role of the corporation. In addition to the columns I write, I've written investigative pieces about money laundering and corruption woes of various Canadian companies. It's usually, in the stories that I've written, US regulators that catch the problem. And I've also interviewed a lot of compliance officers who work within these companies. And when things go wrong, it's because there's this constant war between, in the case of a bank, between the banker and the compliance department. And the things go spectacularly wrong when the bankers are the ones that always win that war. I'm just curious for you, what is the role of the corporation and how is that changing in terms of fighting corruption? And do we need perhaps bigger sticks, to keep people in line? It means stiffer fines. Do we need more whistleblowers? What are your thoughts, Richard?
It's a great question. I mean, Rita, there's always going to be tension in any organization that's growing or that's committed to growth there's going to be tension between that pressure to succeed, the pressure to make, commercial objectives, and the pressure to do it right. So, the organizations that are a little further in this journey, some of which were inspired by a scandal, appreciate that objectives, incentives, I always like to share, turn a pill bottle on the side and you're going to see all the side effects. And all commercial strategies, resources, incentives, they all have side effects. And the more advanced multinationals have everyone at the table together, compliance leaders, business leaders, HR, finance, when they're talking about what does next year look like, to make sure that there are risk assessors at that table, and now it's a virtual table, to make sure that the company's commercial strategies align with ethical and responsible business practices. So the role of the corporation, I have seen in my work that I do with corporations, I've seen that change. So when I first started sharing my story and talking about this and engaging with compliance and legal leaders, and I'll be interested to hear what Anthony has to say about this, but even going back to 2014, the discussion was, what do the regulators expect, right? If we get in trouble, what binders do we need to have when we march in to talk to the regulators, so that we have, and this was the buzzword, 5 years ago, a defensible program. So I saw that corporate eye with almost like it was a criminal law lens in terms of their anti-money laundering, their anti-bribery practices. It was this sort of monolithic focus on what do the regulators expect. And now I think we've advanced in that corporate journey, and I agree with Daniela. Now it's doing business the right way. Well, that's our values. Those are our principles. And we're not going to keep them up on a wall poster. We're going to make sure we operationalize them to the real world risks that people face. And we are going to encourage people, and this is a little different than whistleblowing, Rita, because I think it's more about speaking up. So if someone thinks that they're in the middle of competing corporate objectives, the crosshairs of corporate objectives between the pressure to succeed and that pressure to comply, I think the more advanced and inspired multinationals are encouraging people to say, don't take that decision into your own hands. If you think we're giving you mixed messages, we want to hear about that. Let's unpack that as a team. So the corporate voice here, I think, is changing, and it's changing in the right direction. Because again, going back, even just 5 years ago, ethics and compliance and integrity were usually coming out of the legal and compliance function, where now we're starting to see that coming out of the voice of business leadership. So when you have responsible business practices and ethical expectations, especially right now during a time of crisis, coming out of your business unit leaders, your general managers, your C-suite, and particularly the middle level part of the organization, then I think people really feel like, okay, this is the way we do things. And if I'm struggling with something, I have an organization that says good news can wait, right? A good sale's not going anywhere. We want to hear what you're struggling with. That's more important to share. So it's a journey. It's got peaks and valleys. But speaking on a global basis, I think we're heading in the right direction.
James, well, can you weigh in on this role of the corporation and, what is needed to kind of further evolve that? Or is it the stiffer fines? Is it corporate whistleblowers? So what are you thinking? What are some other solutions that you think might actually work? What's the Transparency International perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely one having right systems in place, and I think we heard it through this week, those not being just checkbox exercises, those systems being lived, and especially frontline staff, if you're operating from Toronto and you have sales or manufacturing staff all over the world, hearing their realities and not just telling them work within the confines of the system, but tailoring the project and adapting it to them. And I think we heard a lot about case studies people want to hear and that constant dialogue. I think we heard some really great things about communication this week, and especially up to the board level, and ensuring that the board knows the anti-corruption program, that compliance officers have a direct line to the board, and that boards want to hear the bad news as well, so that they can give guidance on how to change it. So I think there's this thing of, can we get the right policy now that Canada has a remediation agreement? I think maybe it was Amy previous day had said, there's already lots there, and a lot of companies have things there. It's about integrating and expanding those programs. So there's also a danger of, if the government here's the set standard, that does become a checkbox, and you have some companies that just want to do the legal skirting of do the bare minimum or get around certain wordings. It should be proactive. But on that sense of it should be proactive, that's ideal. As Daniela said, there is changing attitudes, and corporations, many do understand the impacts. I would say some still need education as to the impacts of corruption. I think sometimes there's still a mindset of that's just the way this is done in those countries for some people. But I think with anything, there's the carrot and the stick. There's changing the mindsets of those who want to do the right thing and need some guidance. And then there's just always going to be still some people who want to game the system. And I think you need significant carrot or significant sticks and significant penalties to put fear into those people. And you need significant resources to track them down, because if there's a big penalty that's looming, but they know that no one's going to come get them, and that the chances of them getting caught is relatively low, then somebody might still skirt the system. So it can't just be on paper that you'll pay a huge fine, you'll go to jail, if no one's going to enforce that. And I think at the beginning of this year, when we saw the letter from BlackRock going from shareholder value to stakeholder value, and now we're into the pandemic. And if we're hearing that the pandemic might be a time for everyone to back off their compliance, then what was the point of that letter? Now, this is the ultimate test of stakeholder value versus shareholder value. And if we look at some way that this pandemic might bring around a little bit of change, we're seeing a lot of it in the change for shell companies and the cracking down on tax evasion as a form of white-collar crime for those who have the means to pay their fair share. And I think that's one angle out of this anti-corruption angle that's coming, or out of the white-collar crime angle that's coming out of this. And it goes right back to, I think, when really this trend kind of picked up steam in 2008 with the financial crisis. And in Europe, you saw a lot more wanting to crack down on tax havens as a way to bail themselves out, that they'd set up the self-cannibalization essentially through tax evasion. And it stayed kind of in the headlines through the years, maybe never quite cracking the change that we've needed, but it's always kind of been there. And I think now, if anything, out of white-collar crime perspective, tax evasion is the thing that's maybe coming out of this.
Okay, I want to go to some audience questions because it's just after 1 o'clock. And let's see. Here's one that's.
Sorry, Rita, would I just be able to have 1 minute?
Of course.
I just wanted to, I think, just picking up on a couple of things that Richard said, I agree with absolutely what he said in terms of the role of the corporation. I think the penalties provided for in a Canadian law are stiff. I mean, even the sentences meted out. You look at Samuel Babawi in the SNC case, he got 8.5 years as a first-time offender. That's a significant sentence. What you're not seeing maybe is enough at frequency, so you're not getting the critical mass that's sending the message. There's the stick side, but I think the role of enforcement bodies can also have a major impact on proactive compliance in the carrot element. And in particular, setting that expectation, as I said earlier, that as part of this is what we expect. If you come to us, if we have a case, whistleblowers are going to play a critical role in compliance. And if you have an enforcement agency saying, we're the ones who enforce this, and one of the most egregious things we consider is where you had a whistleblower, reported something, and you brushed it under the carpet. That is going to be fatal. If we have a case against you and we see that kind of conduct, it's fatal. So that's the kind of thing they can build into guidance material, as well as, if you want a remediation agreement, we better see some upfront compliance. That was actually omitted from the remediation agreement as a factor, upfront compliance. I think that should have been there. But it can still be there through guidance by, again, the responsible agency having a technical guidance document saying these are the expectations from a corporate compliance perspective, so that if you ever have a problem, you having done all these things is going to count massively in your favor. That is as I say, it encourages everybody, all the corporate world, to invest in compliance, because it is a preemptive defense, essentially, if something goes wrong, because even good companies have problems. The question is what they had in place. Are they doing their best to stop it? And if they are, they'll be treated very favorably. That's a really important message. And we have the tool now with remediation agreements. Sorry for interjecting.
Oh, that's okay.
Can I just add one more thing, just with regards to the role, because I think that, I think one of the things that we were seeing before a COVID world was that what was happening was a bit of a pushback on the amount of compliance that has actually been put in place in companies. I think that if you look at some of the big companies, the compliance systems are so enormous, and there's so many checks boxes and so many questions that are being raised, that it actually one of the issues that was raised was that it was stopping business actually getting done. So there was a movement of the pendulum sort of coming down to a more holistic view of compliance and what that holistic view means. And just picking onto something that James said, and I think that this is an issue that will be discussed post-COVID, is when we look at the corporation and we look what's happening with the reinterpretation of the corporation as a stakeholder values and no longer just for profit, and a redefinition of the corporate entity, it is happening within a framework of a lot of lack of an erosion of trust in corporations, right? In which the public has criticized and seen all these scandals, and so I think there's a lot of questioning as to whether this new identity of the corporate self is actually true, and what does it mean from an environmental social governance perspective, and within a corporate the corporate corruption aspect of it all. So I think that all this movement means that compliance, and we talked about this in my panel, it can't just be a check in the box. It can't just be due diligence. It has to be something that, as Richard said, it's about values. It's about ethical and moral principles, right? Like, it's gained this really higher level of discussion. And I don't know whether that we're actually going to see that fall flat, or whether we're going to see some results because of this differentiation.
Richard wanted to just add to a comment that I made about, bankers overrunning compliance. And so he just wants to add to that bit of the discussions. So let's do that before we get to the audience questions.
Thank you, Rita. I once heard the head of the fraud section at the DOJ, he was giving a keynote, and he said, one of the ways we measure remediation and our civil and our criminal fines, and the way we measure how robust your compliance program is what happens when there's a disagreement with the business. And I think that is such a robust statement. And if there's one thing we've seen, particularly in some of the recent enforcement actions, is, at least for the Department of Justice, they do not take kindly to compliance officers being rolled over and run over by business leaders. So I think that's such a powerful statement, is, what happens when there's disagreement? How does that get resolved? And the regulators in the US take a very strong opinion about what happens when compliance gets put to the side to roll out, aggressive business strategy.
Okay, excellent. James, I think you wanted to make a comment about companies and proactive collection action?
Yeah, yeah. I know we want to get to our panelists' questions, but just struck me on one thing of talking about, companies out on their own. Do they work with the compliance program, them versus the government? And something that often gets brought up in this realm is collective action. Can companies be proactive and not just sit in their bubble and wait to be reacted upon either by the government or the place they operate in? So sometimes we'd call this corporate social responsibility, go make a school or a road in the place where you're working. What about helping to change the landscape? So one of our board members, John Sipnowich, is the president of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. And there is a brilliant example of a whole industry that was tired of being the victim of corruption in the shipping industry. And so collectively came together and looked, how can we all work together to collectively put our pressure on ports around the world to say we're not going to pay bribes? And I think they've got some brilliant examples. And so everything is going to be different to each industry. And I was about to say companies don't want to play politics, but at the same time, that's what lobbying sometimes is. So I'll back away from that. And it's the idea of, can you help make the environment better? There's often this, I'm one company, what can I do on my own? Sometimes competitors need to work together. If you all don't want to get debarred, if you all don't want to pay fines, it's about collectively trying to change the landscape. And I'd really encourage anybody following today to look up the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network as a great example of collective action.
I'm actually going to do that because I think that might make for a good column, actually. So thanks for that, James. Okay, so I do have some questions here from the audience. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Anthony, I'm going to direct this first one to you, since you're a lawyer. Shouldn't corruption be considered a national security issue too, right up there with terrorism and organized crime? And this one, also has this kind of second part to the question. Where does CSIS fit into this picture?
Well, it doesn't really, as it stands. Shouldn't corruption be considered a national security issue? It's different, obviously, to the threats posed by, terrorism presents an immediate health and safety threat to the lives of Canadians. It's a very acute one. It's a very obvious one. Organized crime is probably close. Yet again, they can have, it's a different kind of threat, but, corruption it's insidious. It has a sort of macro impact. It can have a very serious macro impact on all sorts of things, including public trust in institutions. That can create a knock-on effect with a sense of disenfranchisement and a lack of desire to participate in the democracy. So in a sense, yeah, I can see the link. In terms of whether they should be policed together, I'm not so sure. I think economic crime again requires, there are money laundering aspects to terrorist financing, and sure, there's an overlap there. Same with organized crime. There's a money laundering issue within organized crime. But should they all be housed under the same roof? I don't think so. I think we need an agency that has relationships with those enforcers, or even it's integrated within the RCMP if there's significant structural change there. But the skill set, the expertise are different. The overall strategy behind it needs to be, in my view, more specific to economic crime. There needs to be a strategic goal setting around economic crime, how to tackle it, because I think the tools you need to do or implement rather are different to those that you might need to with terrorism and with organized crime. And in particular, it ties back to something we've just been talking about, which is the engagement of the corporate world. If you have a strategic vision from an economic crime agency that sees the corporate world as a stakeholder and a very important cog in the machine that tackles anti-corruption, you're going to get much more buy-in, and you can do that. And if you look to the US, UK, they do that. Their economic crime enforcers do that. They do engage. They do set very specific expectations, as Richard was giving an example of. on what corporate compliance looks like. You know, that's not something you need to do, or you're not going to engage with organized crime and say, these are our expectations, organized crime. If you're going to do it, do it in the right way. Same with, terrorist organizations, they require a different strategy. So, I can see it has, some parallels, and you would need strong relationships. There is some overlap, but I still think the strategic vision, the actual execution of it needs to be in its own sort of lane, as it were.
No.
Okay, I think James had his hand up first.
I was quick draw on that one, Richard. I think, Anthony's points are really valid on the technical expertise and where it lies within borders of addressing it. But I would say absolutely that corruption should come in from maybe a national defense and foreign policy perspective. There's been a lot of chatter that since we lost our UN Security Council seat of a potential review of Canadian foreign policy. We'll wait to see the mandate letter for Minister Champagne if that comes about. If it does, I think anti-corruption absolutely needs to be an underpinning value that we look at the world through a security lens and through an international development lens, like the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if you don't take corruption as a cause, as a mitigating cause for a lot of the instability, I went through the example of illegal offshore fishing and the instability that causes, the corruption at borders and some of the fragile states that Canadian forces are deployed to conduct training, the destabilization effect. There was an article in Foreign Affairs about the rise of strategic grand corruption from countries like China and Russia, which actually ignored some Western democracies also using that tactic. But we need to have corruption there. Too often, corruption is, from an international development and a peacekeeping perspective, is put into the silo of, okay, anti-corruption unit, you go work and do something. And maybe make an anti-corruption plan and put up a few billboards saying stop corruption. I think the intervention in Afghanistan, there was a lot of new recognition about the role that corruption plays as a destabilizing force, as an empathizing force for units that are for adversaries. And I think a lot of the lessons from that need to be integrated. And even a term that comes up from a security perspective is often the narco-terrorist network. And I worked quite a bit in West and North Africa on these issues back when I was in international development. It was the idea of our narco traffickers working with terrorist organizations, moving cocaine from the Gulf of Guinea up to the Mediterranean and to Europe. And it was a very kind of questionable link that most experts would say it was more a partnership of convenience, but the actor it left out is government in those countries who are also benefiting from the corruption. So for all the money Canada pours into international development and stabilization missions, if we ignore the corruption angle of all of it, it's sending good money after bad. You have to look at it. So I know we took it from the white collar crime perspective there, but I really wanted the opportunity to say how important it is to look at corruption from a peacekeeping and stabilization and international development perspective as well.
Richard, you wanted to jump in?
And to pivot on something that Anthony talked about, if you look at the US and the FBI and the RCMP, I mean, the FBI's remit is also quite wide, except maybe for community policing in the same way the RCMP does. And having been a cooperator for the FBI from 2007 to about 2012, I mean, I saw how special agents were assigned, reassigned, resources get pushed and pulled. And then that changed, I think it was around 3 years ago. And James, I don't know if this came up in one of the earlier panels, but the FBI formed international corruption units. And it's really an interesting model. And there are 4 squads right now. And those special agents that are on those squads are dedicated to international anti-bribery, international money laundering, international antitrust, and kleptocracy recovery. And they cannot be, they can't get a call by the special agent in charge of the office where they're working saying, oh, we need you to work another case right now. Those agents are dedicated, they report into a director. So to the point that Anthony was making, consolidating international crime within specific squads that are distributed throughout the US, I mean, that has made a major shift in terms of the investigatory tools that have been used to pursue some of these big international anti-bribery cases, but also money laundering cases. So I think we saw a really big shift. It may have been a little bit under the iceberg, so to speak. It might not have been noticed, but it certainly had a huge impact on enforcement in the US.
Yeah,
we did have that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anthony.
We did have that in Canada, where there were specialized anti-corruption units, one based in Ottawa and one in Calgary, who did have some success. I mean, the first two corporate prosecutions were Calgary prosecutions, but they weren't. I don't think they were properly ring-fenced. So there was a lot of stories of investigators being pulled off those teams, being given personal protection, duties assigned to other units. So, you know, I think, one, there's a question of how well they were resourced, you know, as good as the people on them were. And again, they get rotated out within 2-3 years. So you get expertise being built up, then you know, you're off to some other assignment to get a promotion. Because, you know, there's the opportunities for promotion within the unit are limited. So I think, yeah, I totally agree, Rich, and as you know, as I've made clear, I think it's you know, a focused unit is the right way to go, or even a focused agency is the right way to go. But it's got to be properly protected, ring-fenced, and there's got to be appetite and opportunities for career progression within that unit, rather than having to go out of it once you get to a certain level of experience. So I just thought I'd add that.
Yeah, just to jump on that quickly, we did bring that up, and we had Carolyn Hackett from the Ontario SFO talk about her units, and you know, maybe it's a lesson to look at their structuring system as well. So, and you know, we wish them all the success, and I hope they are following that model. We also did talk about, I think Jessica Tillotman did bring up the isolated integrated units in the States, and I've met with some of them before in Florida, and it sounds like a really great unit. So there's definitely something to learn. I think it's a big takeaway on, you know, structuring. And I know Anthony is the chair of the TI Canada Legal Committee. This is something they're looking into, is such a unit. One last point on security and anti-corruption is that from the US perspective, they actually are addressing some anti-corruption legislation from a security perspective. And this is where the beneficial ownership registry comes in. So they're taking it from very much a terrorism and anti-crime perspective and pushing forward that bill and getting bipartisan support on it. So we've been pushing it in Canada from multiple angles, from it's good for business angle, it's good for our security angle, and it's the right thing to do from a country that claims to be so pristine angle.
You guys are all inspiring me. If this journalism thing doesn't work out, I'm going to become a secret agent. Imagine the things I could find out. I'd be unassuming, just a middle-aged mom going about her business. Okay, Daniela, I wanted to get to you. There's a question here. While I agree with Anthony and Daniela that political will and high-profile sponsorship for anti-corruption would be nice, should we really be putting our faith in politics as the, quote, catalyst for change, when it seems corruption is itself a systemic problem in politics? Perhaps we should look elsewhere for leadership on this, you know, the corporate sector. So Daniela, I'd like you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So I think that's so in my perspective, this is a dangerous path to tread. I think that there are some success cases, and I think James said a really good success case with regards to the maritime anti-corruption. Now the name slips away from me. Yes, thank you. But look, I originally come from a legal background, and I've worked a lot in corporate social responsibility. If we look at corporate social responsibility, and we look at that trajectory, and we look at now the trajectory of business and human rights, and we look at the trajectory of anti-corruption, if we look at these paths, the self-regulating mode for corporations, I would suggest to you, is not working so well. I think that I think that there have been some limited success, but some spectacular failures. And I'm not sure whether this new corporate entity, as we talked about earlier, is actually going to have such a different ethical and moral values that it will do things that is good for business. I do think that we have one question here, and I'm just going to grab on that sort of little thing. Now the new wording is environmental social governance, right? This is the thing. This is where everybody's talking about, and everybody, from investors to companies to NGOs, everyone is talking about environmental social governance. And of course, the anti-corruption movement is part of this. Of course it is. How is it going to be measured? How are things going to actually move along? I think nobody knows as of yet. I think that there's been a real pull for the parametrization of ESG measurements, and including governance measurements, and how that's going to work within the anti-corruption framework included in this holistic aspect of governance. But I am very hesitant to sort of give the responsibility to corporate actors and say, okay, you lead us down this new golden path of acting, doing business better. I'm quite hesitant and quite critical. I'm not so sure that's the best way to go.
Okay, folks, we're going to have to leave it there because we only have a few minutes left, and I want to turn the floor back over to James. But I want to thank all of you for your great insights, because you not only identified the dynamics of the problem based on your own experience and knowledge and what you've heard this week, but you've also offered, all of you, some fantastic solutions that people can walk away with. So that's great. James, I'm going to shift it back to you for the final word.
Great, thank you, Rita, and thank you so much for just a really excellent moderation of today's panel and wrap up to draw out a lot of the key themes that we had. And thank you so much, Richard, Anthony, and Daniela. I know all three of you have very busy schedules to come join us for a second day and give your insights, and they were exceptional insights as well. And thank you to everybody who joined us throughout all this week, maybe even if you're joining us for the first time this week. I know everyone's got busy schedules, as I just said, and it's really great to have everybody come out. I 100% agree, Rita. I find that the test of panels like these are, do you walk away inspired, wanting to do things? Do you have solutions? And I've got 100 ideas that I want TI Canada to be working on. I think we started the question off with what's wrong with Canada. Maybe we didn't solve everything, but I think we've got a couple tangible ideas to chip away at and investigate a little bit further. And that's the role of our organization. We name and shame when we need to, but we're a solutions-based organization. We try to work with everybody to raise the bar up and find the best way to make Canada better and make it more transparent and accountable. And I think we found ways to do that this week. So to do that, we of course need our supporters. So I'm going to thank our supporters once again for this amazing week that we did. Our platinum supporters, Export Development Canada. Our gold supporters, Banque Nationale, or National Bank of Canada. Flakes, BLG, Deloitte, Dentons, Siemens, Sky Power Global. And our silver supporters, ACFO, Elisa, Kinross Gold, KPMG, Vidoc Group, and Thales. I'm also going to take a moment to thank the TI Canada members and volunteers who put their time towards us. Anthony is the chair of the legal committee as a volunteer. Daniela is on our board. We have a very small staff in Toronto, myself and my colleagues. There's 2 more people on our staff working on the Accountable Mining Project. We rely on a number of volunteers to bring us their knowledge, bring us our experience that we try and funnel into those solutions. And we rely on those members to help amplify TI Canada's message. We have representation from coast to coast, but not coast yet. We'd love to have more members from the north. And so if you want to be a member of TI Canada, I really do highly encourage you to become one. Our goal is to try and mobilize our membership to get you involved, to leverage your expertise. I get people wanting to sign up as a TI Canada member so often saying, I'm coming to you with these expertise. And we want to make the most use of that we can. But we also need more support to be able to do that, so that I've got staff who can help me to mobilize those people. And so we also need our organizational supporters. We're very thankful to the supporters we have. A lot of them have been with us for many years. Some of them are new to us. Some of them just want to have that open line of conversation for good lessons. Some of them really do believe it. I mean, they all believe in the cause, but some of them want to work on tools and collaborate together. And we're more than happy to do that. So if you're thinking about your organization becoming a supporter, drop me a line, james.cohen, Cohen, at transparencycanada.ca. Happy to talk. And of course, to do the really big projects, we need big funders. We'd work on our beneficial ownership project with money from Open Society Foundation. We work on our accountable mining project from money from BHP Foundation. We'd love to do much more evidence-based research to really move the needle forward, to present solid solutions to the government so that, when a scandal does happen, it's not knee-jerk bad policy solutions. It's well-grounded, thought-through policy positions that we've worked on with experts. So if you know foundations, if you're working in a foundation, please consider talking to us about supporting. And if you just want to make a donation to TI Canada, you don't want to go through the paperwork of being a member, of being a supporter, you just say, James, here's my money, give me the tax receipt. I am perfect with that. You can go to transparencycanada.ca and click the big red donate button. I know everyone's suffering through COVID-19. We are getting Canadian emergency wage subsidies, thankfully, to get us through. But as we've discussed through this week, there's lots to tackle. We're a small organization. We punch well above our weight in the good old Canadian way, but we do need to turn the lights on in the office. And we need just a little bit of staff to help coordinate the work of all the fantastic volunteers that we have. So I strongly encourage you to please help our organization out by either making a donation, becoming a member, becoming a supporter, or if you work through a foundation, do that. Or just, spread the word about fighting corruption. We don't want it to be TI Canada knows everything, and if it doesn't come from us, that's it. Work with us, collaborate with us, spread the message of what you hear. All Canadians are capable of tackling corruption. I never want to hear corruption is something that's just the powers that be and the rest of us can't do anything about it. That's bull. Everyone has the ability to fight this. We all have the ability to push for changes in regulation, for changes of enforcement. And I know a lot of the people who've joined us all week are passionate about making that change. So we want to help you, work with you to make that change. So we'll be back again with more reports, more webinars, more motivation as the weeks come on. We got plenty more in the pipeline to come. I want to thank again our panelists all through the week who've been exceptional, lots of great insights, all of our moderators who've had great insights, and all of you. I've seen the chat boxes, lots of commentary, lots of ideas. Hell, even some of you saying I'm off my rocker and don't know what I'm saying. Here's a better idea. Shoot us the better ideas. I've never claimed I'm the person with the best ideas. And so we hope you'll join us again for more webinars and more publications. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe in COVID-19. Please wear a mask. Please wash your hands. And let's all try and get through this. Thank you.